Before we get started with today's lesson, I just put a little reminder of what we did yesterday at the top here. Our sine functions are going to be in the form of y is equal to a times the sine of bx, or b times theta. The absolute value of whatever a is the amplitude of our sine curve. B is the number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi, and then 2 pi over b is the period of the function. So this is just a refresher of what we talked about yesterday to help us graph our functions today. So the first example is we need to graph only one cycle of the sine function y is equal to 1/2 times the sine of 2x. So remember, this equation is in the form of y is equal to a times the sine of bx. So that means that a is 1/2. Remember, a represents our amplitude, so our amplitude is 1/2. B is the number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi. So b, in our case, is equal to 2. That means that there are 2 full cycles between 0 and 2 pi. Well, we only have to do one cycle. So if there are 2 cycles between 0 and 2 pi, that means that one cycle happens halfway between 0 and 2 pi, or 0 and pi. That means that a period is only pi long. Let's see if that's right. So remember, the period is equal to 2 pi over b. Well, we know that b, in our case, is 2. 2 pi over 2, that the 2's cancel, we're left with pi. So in fact, the period, or the distance of one cycle, is just to pi. So all we care about is 0 to pi. So remember from yesterday's lesson, we talked about how there are 5 important points on one cycle of a sine curve, and those points are a 0, followed by a maximum or a minimum, followed by another 0, followed by a minimum or a maximum, and then followed by another 0. So we've got the first 0 and the last 0. So in between these two, there must be another 0, halfway in between. So 0 to pi would be halfway between there, would be pi over 2. Then halfway between those 2 points, 0 and pi over 2, is our maximum. Well, our maximum occurs at an amplitude of 1/2, so this would be 1, this would be 1/2, or 0.5, so our maximum should occur here. And then again, our minimum occurs at an amplitude of 1/2, so we're just going to go down 1/2 to here. And there we go. We have graphed one cycle of the sine curve, y equals 1/2 sine 2x. So why don't you go ahead and do the same thing for example 2. Graph one cycle of the sine function y equals 3 times the sine of pi over 2x. You need to identify a and b. You need to identify your amplitude, your period. Graph a 0 max, 0 min, and max. Press pause, do it on your own, and then press play when you're ready to check your answer. So the equation they gave us is y is equal to 3 times the sine of pi over 2x. Remember, our general form is y is equal to a times the sine of bx. A is your amplitude, so that means our amplitude in this case is 3. And then b would be equal to pi over 2. So b tells us how many cycles occur between 0 and 2 pi, but it doesn't tell us our period, so we need to find our period. And remember, to find the period, you take 2 pi and you divide it by b. So we're plugging in 2 pi over 2. Well, what does that simplify to in terms of a period? So I'm going to do that work off to the side here. So 2 pi divided by pi over 2 could be rewritten as 2 pi times 2 over pi. So pi divided by pi cancels. 2 times 2 is 4. So our period is 4. So that means that we have a horizontal distance of 4 within one cycle. So what we have to figure out is, where is 4 on this graph when we're counting by pi? So our first point still happens at 0. Remember, we're looking for those key points of 0. Sorry, I can't write apparently. Here we go. 0, a max, a 0, a min, and then another 0. So the first 0 happens at 0, and the last 0 has to happen at 4 because we have a horizontal distance of 4. So where does 4 occur between on this axis, this x-axis? Well, I know pi is relatively 3.141. And then 2 pi then is just 2 times pi, which is 6.283, etc. So if this is 3.141 and this is 6.283, it has to happen somewhere in here. Well, halfway between pi and 2 pi is 3 pi over 2, and 3 pi divided by 2 is 4.7. So it has to happen somewhere in here. So what's halfway between pi and 3 pi over 2? Well, let me figure that out. So 3 pi over 2 minus pi divided by 2 plus pi is 3.9. So this would be 3.9. So then 4 is probably about here. I'm just going to erase this work. Just to clean it up a bit. So 4 is around here somewhere. And that's where our last 0 is going to go. So then halfway between 0 and 4 has to be our other 0. So halfway between these two would be about, let's see, 2, 2, 1. So about here. All right, so that would be 2 radians, and that's our other minimum. Then our maximum occurs halfway between 0 and 2, so about here. And an amplitude of 3, so we're going to go up to 3. And there's the first part of our curve. And then halfway between 2 and 4 is 3. And then we're going to go down to -3, since our amplitude is 3. And there we go. And we have successfully created one cycle of this sine curve. Y equals 3 times the sine of pi over 2x. And that's all for today. Have a good weekend.